7.3, more on factoring trinomials of the form ax squared plus bx plus c. In this section, we're factoring three terms where your first term has a coefficient other than 1. So we will follow the same steps as 7.2. The first step is to check the order. So if I look at my four examples here, the order would be largest exponent to smallest exponent. Okay, so for the most part, your trinomials will be in order. Sometimes they could be out of order, so you want to make sure you put them in order. Let's start with A. We want to factor completely. Like I said, the order is correct. Largest exponent to smallest, 3, 2, 1. The order is good. Next step would be to check to see if we have a greatest common factor, which in this case, notice that all three terms have at least one y. So our greatest common factor would be a y. However, it would be even better to factor out a negative y because our first term, you want to keep your first term positive just because it's easier to factor. And a quick tip, a pencil is your best friend in this section because sometimes we might make a few mistakes and we need to erase. And if you have a pen, it's just going to look really messy. So until you get the hang of it, it's always a good idea to use a pencil so that you can erase things. Like if you need to switch the signs or switch the numbers, you can quickly erase that. You'll see once you do the homework. Okay, so I have my pencil, and the first step is factor out my greatest common factor, which in this case we said is a negative y. And so we have, once we factor that out, the signs will be positive 2y squared minus 3y, actually plus 3y and plus 1. How do I know this is correct? Well, take negative y, distribute it back into the parentheses, and you should get back to the original problem. Okay, now we need to factor the trinomial in the parentheses, and so bring down negative y. You need two parentheses. According to the sign rules from 7.2, we have the same sign, so both are positive. And we now need to look at factors of the first term and factors of the last term. In this case, it's pretty straightforward. The only factors of 2 would be 1 and 2. The only factors of 1 would be 1 and 1. So let's try 2y and 1y. You can just write y and then 1 and 1. And remember that you want to check, multiply the inner, which is 1y, multiply the outer, which is 2y, and of course if we add, we get 3y, which matches our middle term, and so we know that our answer is correct. So always remember the last step is to check your work. Okay, so hopefully you could see the pencil here. Maybe I should use a pen. Okay, so for B, order is good. We want to look to see if we have a greatest common factor. So between 12, 7, and 12, there is no GCF. So then two parentheses. According to the sign rules, if the last term is negative, we have to have opposite signs. And then now we have to look at factors of the first term, factors of the last term. In this case, these numbers are the same, but let's write down the factors here. So for 12, and I like to write my factors in order so I don't miss anything. We have 1 and 12, we have 2 and 6, and we have 3 and 4. Okay, so which ones do we use? We can't use all of them. There's only one correct answer, so we need to figure out which one it is. In general, you want to try the ones that are closer together first. So I'm going to try 3 and 4. Okay, I'm going to use a pencil now. So let's try 4y, and let's try 3y. All right, now here's a trick. Since I have 12 here, okay, now you also have 3 choices for these two terms. Do we use 1 and 12, 2 and 6, or do we use 3 and 4? Like I said, try the ones that are closer together first. So we'll try 3 and 4 for this last term as well. Here is a trick. If you have no GCF in the original problem, or if you already factored out your GCF, then you should have no GCF in the first parenthesis and no GCF in the second parenthesis, which will help us figure out where to put the 3 and the 4. So you have to put the 3 and the 4 in a certain place. We cannot just put them anywhere we want. The 3 cannot go here, because if I put the 3 here, do you see how we have a GCF? So if the 3 goes here and the 4 goes here, I have a GCF in both of these parentheses. That cannot happen. And so if we want to use 3 and 4, then the 3 has to go in the first parentheses and the 4 has to go in the second parentheses. That's the only way it'll work. Now we want to check, because maybe 3 and 4 doesn't work. Maybe we have to use 1 and 12 or something. So let's check our work. So we have our inner, which is going to be 9y. And we have our outer, which is negative 16y. And if we subtract these, we get a negative 7y, which matches our middle term. And so I know that this is correct. Now, sometimes you might have the signs in the wrong place. So all you have to do is switch the signs. So for example, if you got the wrong sign here, compared to the middle term, just switch the signs. That's why it's a good idea to have a pencil. Okay, example C. And so again, C, the order is correct. Look at it carefully. Is there a greatest common factor? There actually is. If I look at 12, 60, and 75, I can see that 3 is my greatest common factor. 3 divides 12, 3 divides 60, 3 divides 75. So we need to factor out our greatest common factor first, GCF. Factor out the 3, that leaves me with 4x squared minus 20x plus 75. Now, the trinomial inside the, 25. The trinomial in the parentheses needs to be factored. We have 2 parentheses. According to the sign rules, if the last term is positive, we need to have plus plus or minus minus. How do you know which one it is? Look at the second term. Second term is negative. That means should be minus minus. We need to look at factors of 4 and factors of 25. So let's see, for 4 we have, let's write our options here. I'll use red. For 4 we have 1 and 4 or 2 and 2. And for 25 we have 1 and 25 or we have 5 and 5. Like I said, let's try the ones that are closer together first. And you cannot have a GCF in these parentheses, so just keep that in mind. All right, so I'm going to try 2 and 2. So let's see, 2x, 2x, and 5 and 5, 5 and 5. Hopefully this is correct because I did not use a pencil. Let's check our work. So let's see, multiply negative 10x gives me negative 20x, which is great because that's the middle term, and that means my answer is correct. Okay, so that's done. Finally, our last example. Again, this one is actually a little different. The reason being is that we have 2 variables. We have a and b. But there is a greatest common factor here. sometimes it's confusing to figure out the order when you have two variables, so you might want to factor out your greatest common factor first and then check the order. So let's see, over here I know that I can factor out a 2, because 2 goes into 8, 2 goes into 22, 2 goes into 12, and I noticed that all three terms have a b, and so since it's common to all three, we factor out a 2b. Okay, GCF is 2b. Okay, what's in the parentheses? 4a squared minus 11a plus 6. Okay, here's my trinomial. Bring down the GCF, it's part of the answer, to parentheses. Since the last term is positive and the second term is negative, we have a minus and a minus. Now, look at factors of the first term, factors of the last term. So for 4, like I said, we're going to write this again. We have 1 and 4, 2 and 2. And for 6, you have 1 and 6 or 2 and 3. Okay, so which one is it? Well, let's see. 2, okay, so let's use a pencil here. Let's see what happens here. If I choose, let's say 2 and 2, okay, let's say 2a, 2a. And now, let's say we try 2 and 3. 2 and 3, there happens to be a problem because the first parenthesis contains a GCF. Cannot have a GCF here. If I switch the 2 and the 3, I put the 3 here, the 2 here, now there'll be a GCF in the second parenthesis, so we can't have that. So 2 and 3 will not work with 2 and 2. Okay, so that doesn't work. Can't have a GCF in the parentheses. How about you try 1 and 6? Well, let's say you put the 1 here and the 6 here. I have a GCF in the second parentheses. Can't do it. If I switch the 1 and the 6, there'll still be a GCF, but now in the first parentheses. So this kind of tells me that 2 and 2 will not work. So it has to be 1 and 4. Let me erase what I have here. So we're going to use 1a, okay, 1a and 4a. So you can write a, or you could just write 1a, 1a and 4a. Okay, so I have that right. Now do I use 1 and 6 or 2 and 3? Well, going back to my pencil, if I use 2 and 3, the 2 has to be where? The 2 has to be in the first parentheses. I cannot put it in the second parentheses because then there will be a GCF and I can't have a GCF. So 2 has to be here, 3 has to be here. Let's check. We get a negative 8a and we get a negative 3a. Does that give me a negative 11? It sure does, negative 11a, which matches my middle term. Okay, so I know that it's correct. Let me just use a pen here and we check. So it works. So again, let's box this and then we are done. So really important, check and then use the trick about the GCF, that you should not have a GCF in the parentheses. It tends to help for some of the problems so you know where to place the numbers. And don't forget, pencil is really helpful.